In the rugged Northern California mountains, Logan Matthews, a reclusive former Navy SEAL, leads a hiking group when he discovers disturbed earth off the trail. Ignoring his cousin Mark's concerns, Logan finds an elderly, disheveled man, Robert Matthews, a presumed dead Marine, collapsed and semi-conscious. With nightfall threatening freezing temperatures, Logan builds a shelter, shares rations, and stays by Matthews's side. As dawn breaks, Matthews recognizes Logan from Fallujah, hinting at a shared combat past. Who is this forgotten soldier? Why was he erased? The mystery deepens, pulling Logan back into a world he left behind. Join us at Incredible Stories to honor tales of courage and sacrifice, like Logan's. Subscribe to preserve these powerful memories and uncover hidden truths. Your support keeps these stories alive, reminding us no one is truly forgotten. Hit subscribe and share your story with our community today. Logan Matthews, a 41-year-old former Navy SEAL, had traded the chaos of war zones for the quiet embrace of Northern California's towering pines and rugged trails. After 18 years of service, he'd left the military behind, seeking solace in the mountains, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an eagle. Civilian life felt like a foreign land, cluttered with noise and expectations that grated against the instincts honed in combat. The forest didn't care about the nightmares that jolted him awake at 3 a.m., heart pounding as if he were still scanning for threats in the dark. It didn't question why he memorized every exit in a room or why his shoulders tensed at sudden noises. Out here he could breathe. As a wilderness guide, Logan found purpose leading hikers through the untamed beauty of the mountains, sharing their wonder while keeping his own past locked away. On a crisp late autumn afternoon, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, Logan was guiding a small group along a familiar trail. The golden light filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the path. His cousin Mark, a city dweller from Chicago with a desk job and a penchant for worrying, had joined the group, eager to see the wilderness Logan called home. Mark's enthusiasm was tinged with unease, his urban sensibilities clashing with the vast, unpredictable forest. As the group trudged toward a scenic viewpoint, Logan's sharp eyes caught something off: broken branches, disturbed earth, and faint footprints veering from the trail. A small landslide had churned the soil, hinting at someone's misstep. His instincts, forged in high-stakes missions, flared to life. Without hesitation, he turned to the group, his voice calm but firm. "Keep heading to the viewpoint. I'll catch up in 15 minutes. Need to check something." Mark's brow furrowed. "I saw him around." His city-softened face betraying concern. "What's wrong, Logan? You're acting like this is some covert op." Logan's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Probably nothing, but I'd rather be sure." He was already moving, his boots silent on the forest floor, leaving Mark's worried gaze behind. The group murmured, their voices fading as Logan followed the trail of snapped twigs and scuffed dirt, his movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator tracking prey. 50 yards off the path, beneath the sprawling branches of a pine, he found him. An elderly man slumped against the trunk, his breathing shallow, his clothes torn and caked with mud. A faded military cap clung to his head, gripped tightly even in his weakened state, as if it anchored him to the world. His face, smudged with dirt, bore the weathered lines of a life hard-lived, but his eyes, when they flickered open, held the unmistakable steel of a veteran soldier. Logan's heart clenched, a pang of recognition stirring memories of teammates left vulnerable in far-off deserts and jungles. He knelt beside the man, his emergency medical training kicking in. Pulse weak but steady, skin cool from exposure, signs of dehydration but no major injuries. The man's disheveled state told a story of a fall, perhaps a misjudged step in the fading light. Logan's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, offering sips of water from his canteen. The stranger's trembling fingers closed around the bottle, his gaze locking onto Logan with a mix of gratitude and wariness. Logan didn't ask questions. There'd be time for that later. Instead, he pulled supplies from his pack, constructing a makeshift shelter with a tarp and paracord, shielding the man from the biting wind. He radioed his group, his voice steady despite the urgency. "Found someone in distress. Mark, lead everyone back to the trailhead. I'm staying here tonight." The hikers' voices crackled through the radio, laced with fear. Logan, you can't stay out there alone with some stranger. He could be dangerous, a scammer or worse. Mark's voice cut through, sharp with familial concern. This isn't Afghanistan, Logan. You don't have to play hero for every lost soul. Logan's jaw tightened, his gray eyes unreadable in the fading light. He'd faced worse than a cold night in the woods, missions where hesitation meant death, where loyalty to his team was the only currency that mattered. The nearest ranger station is 4 hours away, he said, his tone flat but resolute. Temperatures will drop below freezing tonight. He won't make it if I leave. Go back. I'll be fine. Mark hesitated, his city-bred caution warring with trust in his cousin's unshakable resolve. Finally, he relented, leading the group away as Logan turned back to the stranger. Night fell, the forest wrapping them in a cocoon of darkness and cold. Logan built a small fire, its glow dancing across the pine needles, casting fleeting shadows. He shared his emergency rations, meager portions of protein bars and dried fruit, and draped his thermal blanket over the man's frail shoulders. His own lightweight jacket offered little warmth, but Logan barely noticed. His focus on keeping the stranger alive. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering fragments of words, names perhaps, or memories of battles long past. Logan sat vigil, his back against the pine, senses alert to every rustle in the underbrush. His mind wandered to his SEAL days, to the teammates he'd pulled from harm's way, to the unspoken code that no soldier is left behind. The forest, vast and indifferent, felt like a mirror to those battlefields, where survival hinged on trust and sacrifice. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, the forest stirred with the chatter of waking creatures. The man's eyes opened, clearer now, studying Logan with a quiet intensity. Recognition flickered in his gaze, not of Logan himself, but of the kind of man he was, one who'd seen war, who carried its weight in his bones. No words passed between them, but a silent understanding bound them, forged in the shared language of service. Logan offered a faint nod, his heart heavy with the ghosts of his past, yet lighter for the life he'd preserved. By morning, as the sun barely crested the horizon, a low rumble broke the stillness. Logan stepped outside his small cabin, where he'd brought the man after a slow trek back. Dozens of Marines stood in a solemn line, their uniforms crisp against the rugged backdrop. They'd come for their brother, the stranger Logan had saved, a veteran whose story was yet untold but whose life had been given back by a man who'd never stopped being a soldier at heart. The campfire crackled softly, its glow casting fleeting shadows across the rugged terrain. Logan, a man whose weathered face bore the weight of countless untold stories, sat tending the flames. Across from him, wrapped in a tattered blanket, was a stranger whose hollow eyes seemed to hold a lifetime of pain. The man's gaunt frame shivered despite the fire's warmth, his breath ragged in the crisp night air. Logan studied him quietly, noting the way his fingers twitched, as if still gripping a rifle that wasn't there. Then, in a voice hoarse and barely above a whisper, the stranger spoke, his words slicing through the silence like a blade. "You were at Fallujah, weren't you?" Logan's body went rigid, his breath catching in his chest. That wasn't a question the civilians tossed around lightly. It was the kind of insight that only came from someone who'd walked through the same hell, who could spot the invisible scars etched into a soldier's soul. The stranger's eyes, glinting in the firelight, held a knowing look, one that stirred memories Logan had spent years trying to bury. The acrid smell of gunpowder, the deafening roar of chaos, the weight of decisions made in split seconds. Fallujah had left its mark on him, a vigilance that never fully faded, no matter how deep he retreated into these woods. He exhaled slowly, forcing the memories back into their cage. "Get some rest," he said, his voice low and steady, a lifeline extended across the fire. "You're not safe out here alone. If you think a good man deserves to be remembered, stay with us for a while." By dawn, the stranger had rallied enough strength to sit upright, his back pressed against a tree. Logan handed him a steaming tin cup of coffee, the rich aroma mingling with the scent of pine. The man's hands trembled as he accepted it, his knuckles white from gripping the cup too tightly. He stared into the dark liquid, as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. "I owe you an apology," he rasped, his voice rough from days, maybe weeks, of disuse. I can't seem to pin down my own name. Everything's a fog. Days bleed into each other out here, like they're all the same. His words carried a quiet shame, a man grappling with the fragments of his own identity. Logan nodded, his expression unreadable but kind. He'd seen this before, veterans who'd lost more than just memories to the relentless aftershocks of war. Some carried their wounds on their skin, others, like this man, bore them in the haunted corners of their minds. "How long you been wandering these woods?" Logan asked, pulling a protein bar from his pack and offering it. The man's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. "Long enough that folks probably think I'm a ghost," he murmured, his tone heavy with resignation. The words hung between them, laced with a sorrow that made Logan's chest tighten. As the man shifted to take the bar, his tattered jacket parted, revealing a glint of metal at his chest. Logan's eyes caught on it, a fragment of military dog tags, caked in dirt but still legible. R. Mathis, 1st Marine Recon, Mathis. The name hit Logan like a shockwave. A half-forgotten news report from 2010 surfaced in his mind. A covert mission gone horribly wrong, a team of Marines presumed dead, an operation so classified it existed only in whispers. The kind of mission that left no paper trail, no closure, just questions that lingered like smoke. Logan's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral, betraying nothing of the recognition that burned through him. "You need a doctor," he said carefully, steering clear of the tags. "I've got a cabin about 3 miles from here. Think you can make it if I help you along?" The man, Mathis, as the tags named him, gave a slow nod, his eyes wary but trusting. The trek to the cabin was grueling, each step a test of endurance for both men. Mathis leaned heavily on Logan's arm, his breath coming in shallow bursts as they navigated the uneven forest floor. Logan offered quiet reassurances, his voice a steady anchor in the silence. "One foot in front of the other, brother. We're almost there." Inside, Logan wrestled with the weight of what he'd seen. Mathis wasn't just a lost hiker. He was a ghost from a mission that had been erased. A man who, by all accounts, shouldn't be alive. What had happened to him? How had he survived all these years alone in the wilderness? When they finally reached the cabin, a modest wooden structure nestled among the pines, the exhaustion was carved into their faces. Logan settled Mathis into a chair, then stepped outside to radio the local authorities. "Found a disoriented hiker," he reported, his voice clipped and professional. "Needs medical help, but no emergency evac. I've got him stable for now." He hung up before they could press for details. Something in his gut warned against drawing too much attention. A man like Mathis, tied to a mission that never officially existed, might not survive the scrutiny of official channels. Over the next few days, Logan tended to Mathis with quiet diligence. He cooked hearty meals, stews thick with vegetables and game, and provided clean clothes from his own dresser. The guest room he offered was sparse but warm, its window framing a view of the sunrise that seemed to ease some of the tension in Mathis's shoulders. Logan asked no questions about the military or how a Marine presumed dead had ended up in his forest. He knew better than to push a man whose memories were a minefield. Mathis, for his part, seemed content to accept the name Logan used, though his silence spoke volumes. He watched everything with a soldier's precision, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. Sudden noises, a branch snapping outside, a gust rattling the windows, sent him flinching. His body braced for a threat that didn't come. He folded his borrowed clothes with meticulous care, stacking them like he was still in barracks. One morning, as Logan stepped onto the porch to check the weather, he caught sight of Mathis staring at the American flag mounted by the door. Without a word, Mathis straightened, his posture snapping to attention. His hand rose halfway to his brow in a salute before he froze, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he seemed to remember where he was. The moment passed, but it left Logan with a quiet ache in his chest. That reflex, that muscle memory, it was proof of a life Mathis hadn't entirely lost, even if he couldn't yet reclaim it. On the 4th night, Logan jolted awake to shouts echoing through the cabin. He hurried to the guest room where he found Mathis thrashing in his bed, sheets twisted around his legs. His eyes were wide open, but they saw nothing, trapped in a nightmare that held him captive. "They left me there," he muttered, his voice raw with betrayal. All of them. The coordinates, they were wrong. Logan recognized the signs of a flashback immediately. He kept his distance, speaking in calm, even tones, repeating Mathis's name until the terror in his eyes began to fade. "You're here now, Mathis," he said softly. "You're safe with me." Mathis finally blinked, recognition returning as he sagged against the wall, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just a bad night." Logan offered a small, understanding nod. "I've had my share too," he said simply, and the words were a quiet confession, a shared understanding between two men who'd both carried the weight of war. The next morning, while Mathis showered, Logan sat at the kitchen table, his mind heavy with thoughts of what came next. Mathis was stabilizing, but his body and mind were still fragile. The dog tags, the mission, the questions. They could wait. For now, Logan's only mission was to keep this man alive, to give him a chance at whatever life he could piece back together. As the sound of running water filled the silence, Logan glanced out the window, where the mountains stood sentinel in the distance. He didn't know what Mathis's future held, but he knew he wouldn't let him face it alone. Logan sat alone in his cabin, the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions pressing against his chest like a stone. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth barely touching the chill in his bones, not from the cold mountain air, but from the ghosts of his past. He'd been a Marine once, part of a brotherhood forged in sweat and blood, and though he'd left that life behind, some ties refused to be severed. His fingers, calloused from years of manual labor and solitude, hesitated over the phone. The number he dialed wasn't one he called often, but it was etched into his memory, a tether to a world he'd tried to forget. On the other end, his former teammate, now a desk-bound officer at the Pentagon, picked up. Logan could almost see him, probably surrounded by sterile walls and stacks of classified files, a far cry from the mud and chaos they'd once shared. Without preamble, Logan asked about Recon Team Echo, the unit deployed back in 2010. He kept his voice steady, but his heart thudded as he braced for the answer. The silence that followed was heavy, a void filled with unspoken truths. When his friend finally spoke, his words were measured, cautious, like a man stepping through a minefield. "That file's been closed a long time, Logan," he said, his tone laced with unease. Team commander was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Mattis, led a 12-man unit on a high-priority intel mission. Official record says they were all lost. Logan's grip tightened on the phone. He could hear the hesitation, the way his friend's voice dipped, as if weighing how much to reveal. "And unofficially?" Logan pressed, his voice low, almost a growl. Another pause, longer this time, stretched taut like a wire about to snap. "There were rumors," his friend admitted, his words slow, deliberate. "One survivor, maybe. Held captive for years. Escaped, but broken. Severe PTSD, memory loss. The brass buried it. A dead officer showing up alive. That stirs up questions about missions that never happened on paper." Logan's jaw clenched. The pieces clicked together, sharp and jagged. Mattis hadn't just been a Marine. He'd been a leader, a man who carried the weight of his team's lives on his shoulders. He'd survived when no one else had, only to be erased, his existence a wrinkle in the Pentagon's carefully ironed narrative. Logan thanked his friend, his voice clipped, and ended the call. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone, his mind churning. Mattis, the man he'd found half dead in the woods, wasn't just a lost soul. He was a ghost, discarded because his survival was inconvenient. The injustice of it burned in Logan's chest, a quiet rage at the thought of a man who'd given everything being forgotten for the sake of bureaucracy. The next morning, Logan was tending the fire, the scent of pine and smoke grounding him as he tried to push the conversation from his mind. The cabin was his sanctuary, a place where the world's noise couldn't reach him. But the low hum of engines shattered that peace, growing louder as they approached his remote access road. His senses sharpened, old instincts kicking in like a switch flipped in his brain. He stepped onto the porch, his boots heavy against the weathered wood, his eyes scanning the tree line. 5 military vehicles broke through the forest, their olive-drab bodies stark against the green. They moved with precision, fanning out into a perfect semicircle in front of his cabin, engines cutting off in eerie unison. Logan's posture stiffened, his body coiled but controlled, neither welcoming nor confrontational. He assessed the scene with a soldier's clarity, a mix of personnel, not just grunts, but officers, medics, and suits. From the lead vehicle stepped a Marine officer, his full-dress uniform crisp, the silver oak leaves on his collar gleaming faintly in the morning light. The man's posture screamed discipline, every movement precise, as if he'd been molded by years of service. Behind him, a security detail fanned out, their eyes scanning the surroundings, while a medical team and a handful of government types in dark suits lingered near the vehicles, their face unreadable. "Mr. Matthews," the officer said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, United States Marine Corps." Logan didn't move, his expression a mask of neutrality. His silence was deliberate, a way to keep control of the moment. He'd learned long ago that words could be weapons, and he wasn't about to fire first. Harrington continued undeterred. "We're here about a GPS transponder signal that activated 3 days ago. A signal tied to someone we once considered a legend in our ranks. Someone we believe you've been sheltering." Logan's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face gave nothing away. His mind raced, though, piecing together the implications. The man he'd found, Mattis, or Mathies as they called him, had been more than a hiker in distress. Logan had pulled him from the edge of death, his body battered, his mind fractured, but he hadn't asked questions. That wasn't his way. "I found a man in trouble," Logan said evenly. "I brought him to safety. That's all." One of the suits stepped forward, his polished shoes absurdly out of place on the dirt. "Mr. Matthews," he said, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. "That man is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Mathis, former commanding officer of Marine Reconnaissance Team Echo, officially listed as killed in action 13 years ago." Logan's gaze flicked to the cabin doorway, where Mattis now stood, his frame gaunt but rigid, his eyes wary as they took in the scene. The man looked like a shadow of a soldier, his face etched with lines of suffering, his posture caught between defiance and confusion. Logan's heart twisted at the sight. Mattis was a man who'd been through hell, and now the world was dragging him back into it. "Then maybe you should talk to him," Logan said, his voice steady but laced with a challenge. The group's attention shifted to Mattis. Harrington approached slowly, his movements deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. Then, in a gesture that carried the weight of years, he stopped and rendered a perfect salute, his hand crisp against his brow. "Sir," he said, his voice ringing clear across the clearing, steady but thick with emotion. "Welcome home, Colonel." Every uniformed Marine snapped to attention, their salutes mirroring Harrington's, a unified gesture of respect that seemed to hang in the air. Mattis stood frozen, his eyes darting between the faces before him. Confusion clouded his features, but beneath it, Logan saw something else. A flicker of recognition, of pride, buried under layers of pain and disorientation. Mattis's hand twitched at his side, muscle memory urging him to return the salute, but his body resisted, trapped in the fog of his fractured mind. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the weight of the past pressing down on them all. Logan, the man who'd chosen solitude over the system, Harrington, bound by duty but moved by loyalty, and Mattis, a ghost reborn, caught between who he was and what he'd become. A young Marine, barely 25, stepped out from the cluster of uniformed figures, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. His face, still boyish beneath the sharp lines of his service cap, carried a weight far heavier than his years. He approached Colonel Matthews with a reverence that bordered on awe, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and grief. "Colonel Matthews, sir," he said, his voice trembling, a fragile thread of sound that seemed to fray at the edges. "I'm Corporal David Jensen. My father was Staff Sergeant William Jensen, the last man you saved from that wreckage before the secondary blast tore through." Tears welled in his eyes, catching the sunlight as they hovered on the brink of falling. The memory of his father's stories, told over countless evenings, flooded his mind. Tales of a fearless officer who ran into chaos when others fled, who carried a broken man through a storm of enemy fire despite the odds. "He told me how you went back in, sir," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. How you hoisted him over your shoulder when his legs were useless, shattered by shrapnel. He said you didn't hesitate, not even when the bullets were flying. He passed last year, sir, but your name was on his lips until the end. He never stopped telling your story. Matthews stood there, his weathered face betraying a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of the commander he once was. His eyes, clouded by years of hardship, seemed to search for a memory buried deep. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, stirring a long-dormant pride, a sense of duty that had never fully left him. He straightened, just enough to hint at the officer he had been, his posture pulling against the slump of exhaustion. "Your father," he said, his voice low and deliberate, as if each word was a stone he was carefully placing. "He had a photograph of you. Kept it tucked inside his helmet, didn't he? A boy with a wide grin, maybe 10 years old." The words came slowly, dredged from a mind fractured by trauma, but they carried a quiet certainty. David nodded, his throat tightening as the tears finally spilled over, tracing paths down his cheeks. "Yes, sir. That was me at 10. He carried that picture everywhere." The memory of his father, proud and unyielding even in his final days, gripped him. He could still see the worn edges of that photo, the way his father's calloused fingers would brush over it, as if it were a talisman against the horrors of war. A medical officer, her uniform crisp and her expression professional, yet compassionate, stepped forward, her clipboard clutched tightly. "Colonel," she said gently, "we need to get you to Walter Reed Medical Center. Your emergency tracker implant activated when Mr. Matthews brought you close enough to a search satellite's range. It's how we found you." Her voice softened, sensing the fragility of the moment. "We've been searching for you for a very long time." Matthews's brow furrowed, the word searching landing like a stone in still water. "Searching?" he repeated, his tone heavy with disbelief, as if the idea that anyone had cared enough to look for him was too much to grasp. His mind churned, grappling with the fog of years spent lost, wandering through a haze of forgotten purpose. He had escaped a prisoner camp, they said, but the memories were shards, sharp, disjointed, and unreliable. "Trust no one in uniform," a voice in his head had whispered for years, keeping him alive but isolated. "Yes, sir," confirmed Harrington, a senior officer with a steady gaze and a voice that carried the weight of conviction. Despite what the official records say, a small team never stopped looking. Intelligence reports hinted you might have survived, might have escaped. The mission to find you was never on the books, but it was real. "We never gave up." His words were a lifeline, pulling Matthys back towards a world he thought had forgotten him. The officer's eyes held a quiet respect, acknowledging the man Matthys had been and the sacrifices he had endured. Government officials, their suits a stark contrast to the military uniforms around them, outlined the plan with clinical precision. Matthys would be transported to Washington, D.C., where he would receive specialized medical care to address the physical toll of his years in captivity and wandering. Targeted therapy would help unravel the knots of trauma-induced memory loss, and a careful reintegration process would ease him back into a society that had moved on without him. "Your service record will be fully restored," one official declared, his tone formal but sincere. "Your medals will be reinstated, and your sacrifice will be acknowledged. The nation owes you that much, Colonel." The words stirred something in Matthys, a faint spark of pride tempered by the exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long. Throughout the exchange, Logan Matthews stood on his porch, a silent sentinel watching the reunion unfold. His weathered hands rested on the railing, his eyes tracing the scene with a quiet intensity. He had found Matthys on a remote trail, a disheveled figure muttering to himself, haunted by ghosts Logan could only imagine. Something in the man's eyes had stopped Logan from calling the authorities immediately. Instead, he had offered shelter, food, and a listening ear, sensing the unspoken bond of a fellow soldier. Now, as he watched the military personnel swarm around Matthys, Logan felt a mix of relief and humility. He had done what felt right, nothing more. A senior officer approached, extending a hand. "Mr. Matthews, thank you for what you did. You brought him home." Logan shook his head, his voice low and steady. "I didn't save anyone," he said, his words carrying the weight of a man who had seen his own share of battles. "I just did what any soldier would do for another. You see a brother in need, You act. That's all. His modesty masked a deep sense of duty forged in the same crucible that had shaped Mathies. Before the convoy prepared to leave, Mathies approached Logan, his steps steadier now, a faint echo of his former command presence returning. His eyes, though still shadowed, held a clarity they hadn't before. "They tell me I've been wandering for years," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "Escaped a camp, but my mind, it wouldn't let me remember who I was or where I belonged. Just kept telling me not to trust anyone in a uniform." He paused, his gaze locking with Logan's. "You could have turned me over right away, had me locked up in some hospital, but you didn't." Logan met his eyes, his expression calm but unwavering. "The mind does what it has to survive," he said simply. "You were a soldier in need. That's all I needed to know." The words hung between them, heavy with understanding. In that moment, they shared something deeper than words. A bond forged in the unspoken trials of combat, a brotherhood that no civilian could fully grasp. Their eyes held a conversation of their own, one of respect, gratitude, and shared scars. As the military vehicles lined up to depart, one of the officers knelt near the trailhead where Logan had first found Mathies. With deliberate care, he drove a small plaque into the earth. The inscription was simple but profound. At this site, one who was forgotten was finally called home. The words were a quiet testament to Mathies's journey and to Logan's role in it. A final line posed a question to anyone who might read it. Have you ever made the right choice when everyone else walked away? Your story matters too. Plus, the words lingered in the air, a challenge and a tribute to those who act when others turn away. A week later, a letter arrived at Logan's doorstep, sealed with the insignia of Marine Corps headquarters. The paper was crisp, the words formal but heartfelt. "Thank you for not forgetting one of our own." Logan read it quietly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it away, and stepped back onto his porch. The world felt a little heavier, but also a little brighter, knowing one lost soul had finally found his way home. Logan sat alone in his modest cabin, tucked deep in the rugged embrace of the mountains, where the air carried the sharp scent of pine and the distant howl of wind through the valleys. The world outside felt far away, and that was how he liked it. Retirement had been his choice, a deliberate retreat from the chaos of war and the weight of command. Yet even in this solitude, the past clung to him like a shadow, its edges softened but never fully gone. His days were quiet now, filled with the rhythm of chopping wood and tending to the small garden he had coaxed from the rocky soil. But his mind, still sharp as ever, wandered back to missions long buried, to faces he'd never forget, and to promises he'd made to men who'd trusted him with their lives. One crisp morning, as dawn painted the horizon in hues of soft pink and gray, a sleek government vehicle rolled up the dirt path to his cabin. Logan's heart quickened, a familiar surge of alertness he hadn't felt in years. He stood at the window, his calloused hands gripping the frame, watching as a young officer stepped out, clutching an envelope sealed with an official crest. The officer's face was all business, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of awe, as if he knew the weight of the man he was approaching. Logan opened the door before the officer could knock, his broad frame filling the doorway, his expression unreadable but expectant. The envelope changed everything. Inside was a letter from the Pentagon, its formal tone unable to mask the gravity of its contents. It was a commendation, a rare acknowledgement of Logan's role in what they now called Operation Homebound, a mission that had lived in the shadows of his memory, locked away with the pain and pride of those days. The letter detailed how Colonel Mathies, a man Logan had risked everything to save, was recovering. His memories, once stolen by trauma and time, were returning in vivid fragments, like pieces of a shattered mosaic slowly coming together. Logan read the words, his jaw tight, his chest heavy with a mix of relief and something deeper, something that felt like absolution. He didn't need the praise, never had. The mission hadn't been about glory, it had been about bringing a brother home. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his desk drawer, its edges crisp against the worn wood. He didn't speak of it to anyone. To Logan, the act of saving Mathies was its own reward, a quiet truth he carried in his bones. 3 days later, at exactly 0700 hours, the low rumble of engines stirred Logan from his morning coffee. He moved to the window, his heart catching at the sight unfolding on his gravel driveway. A line of Marines, resplendent in their dress blues, stood shoulder to shoulder in perfect formation. There were no officers barking orders, no flashing lights or official pomp, just the silent, disciplined presence of men who had come for a purpose. Logan's breath hitched, his mind racing to understand. These weren't strangers. They were brothers, bound by the unspoken code of those who'd faced hell together. He watched motionless as one by one each Marine stepped forward to his front steps. With deliberate care, they planted small American flags into the earth, each one a symbol of honor, of sacrifice, of remembrance. Each Marine offered a crisp salute, their faces etched with solemn respect, before stepping back into line. Logan's throat tightened, his eyes burning with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The last Marine to approach was Corporal Jensen, a young man whose eyes carried the weight of a story Logan didn't yet know. Jensen knelt, placing his flag with the others, but he lingered a moment longer. From his pocket, he produced a framed photograph, worn at the edges but preserved with care. Logan's breath caught as he recognized the image. Colonel Mathis, younger, standing in a desert somewhere far from here, his arms slung around a man Logan knew instantly. Jensen's father. The two men in the photo were grinning, their faces streaked with dust, their camaraderie palpable even through the faded colors. Jensen met Logan's gaze for a fleeting moment, a silent acknowledgement of shared loss and gratitude, before returning to his place in line. No words were spoken, no explanations given. The Marines departed as quietly as they'd come, their boots crunching softly on the gravel, leaving behind a pathway of stars and stripes that led to Logan's door. Logan stood frozen at the window, his heart a tangle of pride, sorrow, and something warmer, something that felt like peace. For the first time in years, a genuine smile broke across his face, reaching his eyes and softening the lines etched by war. He stepped outside, the cool mountain air brushing against his skin, and sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, casting the mountains in a glow of amber and gold. The flags fluttered gently in the evening breeze, each one a testament to the lives he'd touched, the men he'd fought for. He ran his fingers over the photograph Jensen had left, tracing the faces of men who'd become more than comrades. They were family. As twilight settled, Logan's phone rang, the secure line reserved for only a handful of people. He answered, his voice steady but soft. The voice on the other end was his Pentagon contact, a man whose clipped tone couldn't hide his excitement. He remembered the rest today, the voice said. The entire mission, the names of his captors, everything. The doctors are calling it a miracle. Logan leaned back in his chair, the weight of years lifting just a fraction. He's a Marine, he replied, his voice thick with quiet pride. Remarkable is standard issue. In that moment, Logan understood something profound. Some who walk through the fire of war never truly walk alone, though the scars they carry can make it feel that way. Sometimes they need a reminder that they haven't been forgotten, that their sacrifices are seen, their stories preserved. For Logan, bringing Mathis home hadn't been about orders or medals. It had been about a promise kept, a bond unbroken. He'd acted not because he knew Mathis, but because he knew what it meant to be a Marine, to carry the weight of duty even when the world looked away. The flag stood sentinel in the fading light, a quiet tribute to a man who'd never sought recognition but had earned it all the same. Logan's heart swelled with a truth he'd always known. Sometimes the smallest acts, planting a flag, saving a brother, ripple through time, touching history itself.